Dear learners, welcome back to WSE English Story, where history comes alive, and English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we will step into the world of a woman whose name has echoed through centuries, a queen who stood against the might of the greatest empire on earth. Her name is Cleopatra. Cleopatra was not just a queen of Egypt. She was a symbol of intelligence, courage, and resilience in a time when women were rarely allowed to lead. She dared to dream of independence for her kingdom while Rome, the unstoppable empire of the ancient world, spread its power across nations. Her life was filled with love, betrayal, political intrigue, and a burning desire to protect her land. This is not only a story of battles and alliances, but a story of the human heart, ambition, sacrifice, and the courage to rise when the world seems impossible to face. Through her journey, you will improve your English skills, but more than that, you will walk alongside a queen who became a legend. If you'd like to support our work, you're welcome to like, comment, and share this video. Your support means a lot and helps us continue creating meaningful stories for you. Get ready for a journey filled with suspense, drama, and inspiration. Let's begin the story of Cleopatra, the queen who dared to challenge an empire. To understand Cleopatra's greatness, we must first step back into her world. Egypt, in the 1st century before Christ, was no longer the invincible land of the pyramids and pharaohs. It was a kingdom of incredible beauty, wealth, and tradition, but also a land under threat. Rome, rising in power, was like a giant reaching out to swallow every nation in its path. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC into the royal family of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for almost 300 years, ever since Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy, took control after Alexander's death. But unlike the ancient pharaohs, the Ptolemies were of Greek origin. They spoke Greek, followed Greek customs, and often looked at Egypt's native traditions with distance. This created a strange duality in the kingdom, a proud Egyptian population ruled by a foreign Greek family. Into this world of division and fragility, Cleopatra was born as the daughter of King Ptolemy XII. He was known as Auletes, the flute player, a weak king often criticized for indulging in pleasures rather than protecting his throne. His rule left Egypt politically unstable, its treasury nearly empty, and its survival increasingly dependent on the will of Rome. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by both luxury and danger. In the royal palace at Alexandria, she would have seen scholars, philosophers, and traders from every corner of the Mediterranean. Alexandria itself was the jewel of Egypt, home to the famous library, a lighthouse considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, and bustling markets where cultures met. Yet behind the beauty, Cleopatra's childhood was shadowed by political rivalries, assassinations, and the constant fear that Rome might intervene directly. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra took a deep interest in Egyptian traditions. Most of her ancestors had treated Egypt as a possession rather than a homeland. But Cleopatra learned the Egyptian language, something few Ptolemies had done. She embraced the role of pharaoh, not just as a Greek queen but as the true ruler of Egypt, connecting herself to the sacred traditions of the Nile. This decision would later give her an unshakable bond with her people. She was highly educated, trained in philosophy, mathematics, politics, and languages. Some say she could speak as many as 9 tongues, which allowed her to negotiate with foreign envoys without interpreters. From a young age, Cleopatra was not only intelligent but also determined to become more than a ceremonial queen. She was preparing to fight for her kingdom's survival in a world dominated by men and empires. But fate would soon test her. For when her father died, Cleopatra was still very young. And the fragile throne of Egypt would throw her into a struggle that would shape not only her destiny but the fate of her nation. When Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BC, the crown passed to his children. According to Egyptian custom, Cleopatra, only 18 years old, was to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was just about 10. On paper, this arrangement looked like stability. In reality, it was a recipe for conflict. The throne of Egypt was not a peaceful place. Royal siblings were often forced into rivalry, sometimes even murder, to secure power. Cleopatra quickly realized that ruling would not be a matter of wearing a crown and sitting in a palace. It would mean survival in a storm of betrayal, ambition, and foreign interference. From the very beginning, Cleopatra faced resistance. Powerful courtiers and generals, seeing her young brother as easier to control, pushed her aside. Within a short time, Cleopatra was stripped of power, forced to flee Alexandria, and left in exile. For most people, this would have been the end. A young queen, alone, betrayed by her own family, far from the throne, few would have imagined she could return. But Cleopatra was not like other rulers. She refused to accept defeat. Exile became her school of resilience. Instead of despair, she looked outward. She studied the wider political landscape, and one truth became clear: Egypt's future depended on Rome. At that moment, Rome was not only the strongest military power in the Mediterranean but also a place torn apart by its own rivalries. Two of Rome's greatest men, Julius Caesar and Pompey, were locked in civil war. Their conflict would decide who controlled the Roman world, and for Cleopatra, this was both a danger and an opportunity. If she could win the support of Rome's most powerful man, she could reclaim her throne and restore Egypt's independence. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, her brother's advisors declared her an enemy. They ruled in the boy king's name, but their real goal was their own power. Egypt became a stage for manipulation, with its young ruler nothing more than a puppet. The people, however, had not forgotten Cleopatra. She had spoken their language, honored their gods, and connected with their traditions in a way her ancestors had not. Cleopatra's exile became the seed of her determination. She began to see herself not just as a queen fighting for a crown, but as a protector of Egypt's dignity. This transformation shaped her character forever. She was no longer simply the daughter of a king. She was a woman who would fight against empires for the survival of her people. And then destiny intervened. The Roman Civil War spilled into Egypt's waters. Pompey, fleeing from Caesar, sought refuge in Alexandria. But instead of safety, he met betrayal. The boy king's advisors had him murdered, thinking they would please Caesar by eliminating his enemy. Instead, they unleashed a storm. Caesar arrived in Alexandria, furious at the treachery, and suddenly Egypt became the stage for one of history's greatest encounters. For Cleopatra, this was the chance she had been waiting for. She would risk everything to return to Alexandria, not as an exile, but as a queen ready to meet the most powerful man in the world. Let me ask you a question here. If you were in Cleopatra's place, young, betrayed, exiled, and facing the shadow of Rome, would you risk everything to take back your throne? Cleopatra's return to Alexandria was not a simple march back into the palace. Her enemies had grown stronger, and her brother's advisors would stop at nothing to keep her from power. To step into the city again meant stepping into danger. Yet Cleopatra was not guided by fear. She was guided by vision. She knew that her only chance lay with Julius Caesar, the Roman general whose name alone could shake kingdoms. Caesar was in Alexandria, demanding order, demanding loyalty. If Cleopatra could win his support, she could reclaim her throne. But how could she reach him when the palace was filled with her enemies? Here, history gives us one of the most daring and unforgettable images of Cleopatra. According to legend, she had herself secretly carried into Caesar's chambers rolled inside a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack. When the fabric was unrolled, Caesar found not a defeated exile, but a young queen standing proudly before him, her eyes alive with determination. That moment was more than a clever trick. It revealed Cleopatra's true gift, the ability to transform weakness into strength, exile into opportunity, and risk into triumph. Caesar, captivated by her intelligence, courage, and charm, agreed to support her claim. But this alliance came with a price: war. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors refused to surrender. Alexandria turned into a battlefield, with Roman legions clashing against Egyptian forces in narrow streets and by the shores of the harbor. Fires swept through parts of the city, and the great library of Alexandria, filled with countless scrolls of ancient knowledge, is said to have suffered damage during the chaos. The war was fierce, and for Cleopatra, it was a test of loyalty and endurance. She did not hide in safety. She stayed close to Caesar, advising, negotiating, and standing as a queen even in the darkest hours. For a young woman who had once been cast into exile, this was a transformation. She was no longer a victim of betrayal, she was now shaping the destiny of her kingdom with her own courage. When the fighting finally ended, her brother's army was defeated, and Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. Cleopatra emerged victorious, restored as Queen of Egypt, this time ruling beside another younger brother by name, but in truth with her own power strengthened by her alliance with Rome. Yet this was not the end of her struggle, it was only the beginning. Egypt's independence still hung by a thread. Caesar returned to Rome, and Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesar Ion, whom she believed would one day unite the power of Rome and Egypt. But history does not move in straight lines. Caesar himself would soon face betrayal, assassination, and death in Rome, leaving Cleopatra once again exposed to the storms of empire. But before that tragedy, Cleopatra had proven something vital: she had the will to fight for her kingdom, even against impossible odds. Her daring return, her alliance with Caesar, and her triumph over exile had transformed her into more than just a queen. She was now a living symbol of resilience. The queen who had once been pushed aside had risen again. And yet, destiny was far from finished with her. Ahead lay her greatest tests, her deepest loves, and the choices that would bind her forever to both glory and tragedy. As you listen, ask yourself, what gives a leader true strength, armies and wealth, or the courage to rise when everything seems lost? For a brief moment, Cleopatra stood at the height of triumph. She had reclaimed her throne, secured an alliance with Julius Caesar, and given birth to Caesar Ion, the child she believed would one day bind Egypt and Rome together. In her palace at Alexandria, she must have felt both pride and relief. But history never rests. The turning point of her life was approaching, and with it, the most dangerous storm she would ever face. Caesar returned to Rome, leaving Cleopatra as the Queen of Egypt. But her connection with him meant that her fate was now tied to the fate of Rome itself. Rome was no longer simply an empire watching from a distance. It had become her partner, her threat, her destiny. In 44 BC, the unthinkable happened. Julius Caesar, the man who had risen above all rivals, was assassinated by his own senators on the Ides of March. For Cleopatra, the news must have felt like the ground itself had been torn away. The protector of her throne, the father of her child, the man who had shaped her path, gone in a single moment of betrayal. Now Rome was once again plunged into civil war. Caesar's assassins believed they had restored liberty, but in truth they had opened the gates to new rivalries. The men who rose to power after Caesar's death were Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's loyal allies. Together, they hunted down Caesar's murderers and sought to control the empire. For Cleopatra, survival meant choosing wisely whom to trust. It was Mark Antony who called for her presence. He summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, a city in Asia Minor, demanding that she explain why Egypt had not offered support after Caesar's death. Many in Cleopatra's position would have gone humbly, fearful of Roman anger. But Cleopatra did not approach Antony as a supplicant. She arrived as a queen. Sailing up the river in a golden barge, its sails purple, its oars of silver, Cleopatra presented herself as if she were the goddess Isis herself. Her charisma, her intelligence, and her command of spectacle turned what could have been an interrogation into the beginning of one of history's most famous partnerships. Mark Antony was a soldier, bold but impulsive, with a taste for grandeur. Cleopatra offered him not only wealth and alliance but also a vision of power greater than Rome alone. Their meeting was more than political, it became personal, binding the fate of Egypt to Antony's cause. This was the turning point. By choosing Antony, Cleopatra was making her boldest gamble. With him, she could protect Egypt from Roman domination and perhaps even see her dream realized, an Eastern empire strong enough to stand against the West. Without him, she would be at the mercy of Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, whose ambitions for sole rule of Rome were already growing. Together, Antony and Cleopatra would have children, wage wars, and dream of a future where their families would rule the world from Alexandria. But this choice came at a cost. To Rome, Cleopatra was no longer simply a queen, she was a foreign temptress, a dangerous influence corrupting one of their greatest generals. To Octavian, she became the perfect enemy, the symbol he needed to rally Rome against Antony. From this point on, Cleopatra's life was no longer just about defending Egypt. It became a struggle of empires, East against West, love against politics, hope against destiny. The turning point was clear. By standing with Antony, Cleopatra was stepping onto a path that would lead to both glory and tragedy. History teaches us that sometimes the greatest choices are also the most dangerous. Cleopatra chose not to bow before Rome. She chose to fight for her people, her vision, and her place in history, even if it meant risking everything. The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony burned brightly, but it also drew them closer to the heart of Rome's fury. For Octavian, the young and calculating heir of Caesar, Antony's bond with Cleopatra was both a political gift and a personal insult. He painted Cleopatra not as a queen defending her people, but as a seductress who had bewitched one of Rome's greatest generals. In Rome's eyes, Antony was no longer loyal to the Republic, he was enslaved by the Queen of Egypt. This was not only propaganda, it was war. Octavian declared that Antony had betrayed Rome, and by extension, that Cleopatra herself was Rome's enemy. The Mediterranean world braced for a confrontation that would decide the fate of empires. Cleopatra and Antony gathered their forces. Their fleets stretched across the harbors of the eastern Mediterranean, their armies filled with Egyptian wealth and allies. They believed they could stand against Octavian's growing power. But Octavian was patient, disciplined, and determined to crush them. The climax came in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium, a naval clash off the western coast of Greece. Cleopatra's ships, adorned in the splendor of Egypt, sailed beside Antony's fleet. On that fateful day, the winds of destiny turned against them. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, outmaneuvered their ships, cutting off supplies and trapping them in the bay. In the chaos, Cleopatra made a desperate decision. With her fleet threatened, she sailed through a gap in the battle line, her ships breaking free toward safety. Antony, seeing her departure, abandoned the fight and followed. To their enemies, this looked like cowardice. To their supporters, it was a moment of heartbreak. The might of Egypt and Antony's legions collapsed in a single day. From that moment, Octavian's victory was only a matter of time. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, but hope was fading. Octavian pursued them relentlessly, bringing his armies to the very heart of Egypt. Within Alexandria, fear and despair spread. The queen who had once seemed invincible now faced her final trial. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's forces besieged the city. Antony, broken by defeat, tried one last desperate stand. But he was betrayed, and in the final chaos, he heard the false news that Cleopatra was already dead. Overcome with grief, Antony fell upon his sword. Yet fate allowed them one last meeting. Mortally wounded, Antony was brought to Cleopatra's chamber. There, in her arms, he breathed his last, leaving her with a grief as deep as the Nile itself. For Cleopatra, this was the ultimate sacrifice, the man she had fought beside, the partner she had chosen, gone forever. Octavian soon entered Alexandria. He wanted Cleopatra alive, not for mercy, but for triumph. He planned to parade her in Rome as a prisoner, chained and humiliated. For Cleopatra, this was a fate worse than death. She had lived as a queen, a goddess, a protector of Egypt. To be displayed as a captive was unthinkable. And so, in one final act of defiance, Cleopatra chose her own end. According to legend, she arranged to have a poisonous asp, a sacred Egyptian snake, brought to her. In the quiet of her chamber, dressed in her royal robes, she took the serpent to her breast. In that moment, she embraced death not as surrender, but as freedom. Her body was later found, calm and regal, as if she were sleeping. Even in death, Cleopatra denied her enemies the victory of seeing her broken. This was the climax of her life, sacrifice and choice. She lost the battle, but she chose dignity over humiliation. She lost her kingdom, but she secured her legend. And in that choice, she transformed from a mortal queen into a timeless symbol of courage. Let me ask you, if you stood at the edge of defeat, with your legacy in danger of being erased, would you cling to survival at any cost, or, like Cleopatra, would you choose dignity, even in death? At first glance, Cleopatra's story may appear to end in tragedy. Her armies were defeated, her beloved Antony was gone, and Rome seized Egypt, transforming it into a province of the empire. Yet when we look deeper, we see that Cleopatra's legacy is not one of failure, but of extraordinary triumph. Her victories were not measured only in battles won or lands protected. They were measured in the endurance of her spirit, the brilliance of her vision, and the way her life has inspired generations. Cleopatra stood against Rome, the greatest empire of her time, longer than anyone thought possible. She preserved Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades while surrounding kingdoms fell. She played the dangerous game of Roman politics with intelligence and courage, shaping the balance of power between Caesar, Antony, and Octavian. Few leaders, male or female, dared to do what she did, not only to resist Rome, but to challenge it openly. Her reign also brought prosperity to Egypt. She strengthened trade along the Nile and across the Mediterranean, ensuring her people's survival despite constant pressure from foreign powers. She was not simply a queen of war but also a ruler of culture, supporting learning, science, and the preservation of Egyptian traditions. By learning her people's language and presenting herself as a pharaoh in the old style, she gave Egyptians a ruler who truly felt like their own after centuries of Greek domination. But perhaps her greatest achievement was personal. She reshaped the image of female power. In a world where queens were often expected to be silent, symbolic figures, Cleopatra proved that a woman could rule with intelligence, authority, and vision equal to, or greater than, that of men. She faced betrayal, exile, war, and the might of Rome itself, yet never surrendered her dignity. Her story still speaks to women and men today who dream of rising beyond the limits imposed on them. Even her death was, in a sense, a victory. Octavian wanted to display Cleopatra as a trophy, parading her through Rome to humiliate her before the world. By choosing her own end, Cleopatra denied him that triumph. She chose to write the final chapter of her life with her own hand. In doing so, she ensured that her legend would live on not as a prisoner's, but as a queen's. For Rome, her fall marked the end of an era. With her death, the line of the pharaohs, stretching back 3,000 years, was broken. Egypt became just another province of Rome. Yet in memory and myth, Cleopatra rose higher than any empire could contain. Her story became the subject of plays, poems, and paintings. Her name became eternal. And isn't that the greatest achievement of all? To live in such a way that more than 2,000 years later, people still remember your courage, your brilliance, your struggle, and your defiance. Cleopatra lost a kingdom, but she won immortality. She became a voice for resilience, for ambition, for the belief that even in the face of impossible odds, one person can stand against the tide of history and leave behind a flame that never goes out. As you think about her journey, reflect on this: true victory is not always about defeating others. Sometimes, it is about refusing to let the world erase your dignity, your values, and your voice. Cleopatra's story, though marked by loss, continues to shine as one of history's most powerful legacies. She lived in an age where women were rarely given authority, yet she dared to sit on a throne and fight for her people. She faced betrayal within her own family, exile, and the crushing force of Rome, but she refused to bend. Even in defeat, she chose to protect her dignity rather than allow herself to be displayed as a prize. Her life reminds us that greatness is not always about victory in battle. Sometimes, greatness lies in the ability to stand unbroken, to make choices with courage even when the outcome is uncertain. Cleopatra's resilience shows us that leadership is not simply about power, it is about responsibility, vision, and sacrifice. She also leaves us a lesson about identity. Though born into a Greek dynasty, Cleopatra embraced Egypt as her true home. She learned her people's language, honored their gods, and became a pharaoh not just in name but in spirit. In doing so, she united two worlds, the traditions of Egypt and the legacy of Greece. Her ability to adapt, to connect with her people, and to represent their pride is what made her more than just another ruler. To the world, she became a symbol. To the Egyptians, she was their queen. To Rome, she was a threat. And to us, she remains an inspiration, the story of a woman who refused to let history silence her. Cleopatra's journey teaches us three timeless lessons. True strength lies in resilience, not in never falling, but in rising each time we are cast down. Identity and loyalty matter. A leader must stand with their people, not above them. Dignity is a form of victory that no enemy can take away. 2,000 years have passed since Cleopatra walked the halls of Alexandria, yet her presence still echoes. Every time we hear her name, we are reminded of courage, ambition, and the eternal struggle for freedom and self-respect. So, as learners and dreamers, what lesson will you take from Cleopatra? When life challenges you, when the odds seem impossible, will you surrender, or will you, like the Queen of the Nile, rise to face destiny with unshakable courage? Dear learners, you have just walked through the life of one of history's most unforgettable figures. Cleopatra, the Queen of the Nile, dared to challenge the greatest empire of her age. She faced betrayal, exile, love, war, and loss, but through it all, she remained true to herself, to her people, and to her dignity. Her story reminds us that even when the world seems overwhelming, we still have the power to choose. We cannot always control victory or defeat, but we can always control how we face them. Cleopatra chose courage over fear, identity over compromise, and dignity over humiliation. That is why her name still echoes across centuries. Think about your own journey. What challenges stand before you? What dreams seem too great, too risky, or too far away? Cleopatra's story is a reminder that the greatest achievements often come from daring to rise, even when the odds are against us. If this story has inspired you, share it with others. Let Cleopatra's legacy remind the world that courage, resilience, and dignity never die. Support our work by liking, commenting, or subscribing. Your encouragement helps us bring more powerful stories to life. And remember this, you, too, carry the power to shape your destiny. Your choices, your courage, your voice, they matter. History is not only written by kings, generals, or empires. It is written by anyone brave enough to rise when the world tells them to fall. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming, and keep believing in your own strength. Goodbye for now.